In the final, desperate moments before God unleashes the great flood to cleanse a corrupted world, the book of Genesis gives us a brief, cryptic, and terrifying explanation for why such a cataclysm was necessary. It's a passage so strange, so out of place, that it feels like a fragment from a different, darker story. In Genesis chapter 6, we read, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose." The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. And then, just as quickly as it appears, the narrative moves on. The camera cuts away. We are left with a whirlwind of haunting questions that the text refuses to answer. Who, precisely, were these sons of God? The phrase implies they were not ordinary men. Where did they come from? And what was the nature of their transgression that it, combined with human wickedness, was so heinous it provoked a sentence of global annihilation? Who were the Nephilim, these mighty men of old, and what became of them for centuries? This passage has been treated like a cosmic crime scene with most of the evidence blacked out. Theologians have offered safe, demystified explanations, suggesting the sons of God were merely the righteous descendants of Seth intermarrying with the unrighteous. But this interpretation feels weak, unsatisfying. It fails to capture the sheer, world-altering gravity of the event. It doesn't explain the giants. It doesn't explain why this specific sin is highlighted as the final straw before the flood. The vagueness of this account is not a sign of its unimportance. It is the opposite. It is the scar tissue, the redacted report that proves a much larger, more detailed and more terrifying story has been deliberately obscured. This is not just a strange footnote in the history of the world before the flood. This is the censored prologue to the story of a supernatural invasion. And the beings at the heart of that invasion had a name, a rank, and a mission, a name that was systematically erased from the Bible you read today. To read the blacked-out lines in the Genesis 6 report, to uncover the identities of these mysterious sons of God, we must turn to the texts that the ancient censors tried to destroy. We must summon the eyewitnesses to this cosmic crime, the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. These are not just supplementary texts. They are the unabridged case files, the full, terrifying testimony of what truly happened in the days before the flood. And they do not speak in vague terms. They give these beings a name, a title, and a specific rank in the heavenly hierarchy. They were the Watchers. This was not a generic term for angels. It was a specific class of celestial beings dispatched from the highest heavens and given a sacred duty to watch over, guide, and instruct the fledgling human race in the ways of righteousness. They were guardians, tutors, divine overseers. But the testimony of Enoch and Jubilees is a story of a mission catastrophically betrayed. The Watchers did not just fall into sin. They orchestrated a full-blown, organized rebellion. This was not a series of individual, impulsive mistakes. It was a conspiracy. The Book of Enoch states that 200 of these Watchers, under the command of a high-ranking angel named Samjaza, gathered on the summit of Mount Hermon. There, they bound themselves together with a mutual oath, a pact of treason, to defy the will of God, descend to the human realm, and take what was not theirs. This single revelation changes everything. The vague, almost passive description in Genesis of sons of God seeing and taking is transformed into an active, premeditated military-style operation. They were not just succumbing to temptation, they were launching an invasion. And this brings us to the core of the censorship. Why was the specific and technical term, the Watchers, erased from the canonical record and replaced with the ambiguous phrase, Sons of God? Why was the story of their organized, oath-bound conspiracy edited out, leaving only the sanitized summary of their lust? The answer is simple: to name them is to give them substance. To detail their conspiracy is to reveal the true, terrifying nature of the enemy. The gatekeepers of history did not want you to know that the fall of the ancient world was not just a story of human failure. It was the story of a mutiny in the heavens, an act of cosmic treason by God's own appointed guardians. And the full story of their crimes is even more shocking than their identities. The sanitized account in Genesis 6 leaves the impression that the transgression of the sons of God was a series of individual, spontaneous acts of lust. It reads as if various divine beings, scattered across the earth, simply saw beautiful women and decided to take them as wives. It feels random, disorganized. But the Book of Enoch, acting as our primary witness, obliterates this safe interpretation. It reveals that this was not a lapse in judgment, it was a calculated conspiracy. Enoch chapter 6 provides the chilling details of the muster roll for this rebellion. It was not a random few, but a significant portion of the Watcher command. 200 of these high-ranking angels assembled on the summit of Mount Hermon, a place whose very name in Hebrew, Herem, means a curse or a consecrated oath. It was there, on the cursed mountain, that their leader, a powerful angel named Samjaza, addressed his subordinates. He acknowledged the profound sin they were about to commit and the terrible judgment that would follow. But fearing he would be the only one to bear the punishment for this great sin, he demanded an oath of allegiance. He essentially said, "We do this together, or we don't do it at all." And so, Enoch records, they all swore together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. This is a scene of cosmic treason. It is the spiritual equivalent of a cabal of generals meeting in secret to plot a coup against their king. This was not a moment of weakness. It was a declaration of war. They were not simply falling, they were defecting as a unified battalion to the side of rebellion. This detail is absolutely crucial, and its removal from the Genesis account is a deliberate act of censorship. Why? Because a story about a premeditated, oath-bound conspiracy is infinitely more dangerous than a story about individual angels succumbing to lust. A conspiracy implies intelligence, organization, and a shared, malevolent agenda. It transforms the sons of God from a group of morally weak individuals into a disciplined, demonic army with a clear chain of command. This is a far more terrifying picture of evil. It suggests that the forces of darkness are not chaotic and disorganized, but strategic and unified in their opposition to God. To include the story of the oath on Mount Hermon would be to give the faithful a glimpse into the organized nature of the enemy they face. The gatekeepers, in their desire to simplify the narrative, chose to hide this crucial piece of intelligence. They erased the war council, leaving us only with the scattered reports from the battlefield, hoping we would never realize that the invasion of our world was a carefully planned and executed military operation. The censored report in Genesis focuses on a single crime: the sons of God taking human wives. This act alone is presented as a grievous sin, a violation of the created order. But the full, unredacted testimonies of Enoch and Jubilees reveal that this was only the first half of a far more sinister, two-pronged assault on humanity. The Watchers did not just seek to corrupt humanity's bloodline, they sought to corrupt its very soul. Theirs were the twin crimes of hybridization and the transference of forbidden knowledge. The first crime, hybridization, is what Genesis hints at with the birth of the Nephilim. But Enoch and Jubilees provide the horrifying details. These were not just mighty men. They were a monstrous hybrid race, half angelic and half human, possessing the supernatural strength of their fathers and the mortal appetites of their mothers, amplified to a terrifying degree. The texts describe them as insatiable giants who devoured all of the earth's resources, then turned on the animals, and finally on humanity itself, consuming flesh and drinking blood. They were a biological weapon of mass destruction, a cancerous race that was literally eating creation alive. But as horrific as this physical corruption was, their second crime was arguably even more devastating. This was the illegal transfer of classified heavenly information. The Book of Enoch provides a detailed list, a charge sheet, of which angel taught which forbidden art. Their leader, Samjaza, taught enchantments. But it was another, a powerful angel named Azazel, who seemed to be the chief technology officer of this rebellion. Azazel, Enoch says, taught men the art of war, how to forge swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught them metallurgy and the secrets of the earth. He also taught women the art of deception, the making of cosmetics, the coloring of tinctures, and the use of precious stones to beautify themselves and seduce men. Other Watchers taught astrology, the knowledge of the clouds, the signs of the earth, and the signs of the sun. This was not a benevolent enlightenment. It was a deliberate weaponization of knowledge. They gave a spiritually immature race the technological and supernatural tools for self-destruction. They taught war to a world meant for peace. They taught sorcery to a people meant to worship God. They taught vanity to a race created in the divine image. And this is why their story had to be erased. The Genesis account, by focusing only on the lust, makes the sin seem almost understandable, a crime of passion. But the full story reveals a far colder, more calculated act of sabotage. The Watchers were not just lustful, they were insurrectionists. They sought to create a new world order, a transhumanist society of their own making, populated by their hybrid offspring and empowered by their stolen heavenly technology. They were not just breaking a rule, they were attempting to hijack the entire human project. And the God of Genesis had no choice but to reboot the entire system with a flood to prevent this demonic utopia from succeeding. The Book of Genesis leaves the fate of the Nephilim shrouded in mystery. It simply states, there were giants on the earth in those days. And then the narrative moves on to the flood. The implication is that they, along with the rest of corrupted humanity, were wiped out by the waters. But the Book of Enoch reveals a far more chilling and persistent legacy. This is a truth so fundamental to understanding the spiritual landscape of our world that its omission from the canonical Bible is one of the most significant acts of censorship in history. Enoch testifies that while the physical bodies of the Nephilim, these violent, hybrid giants, were indeed destroyed in the deluge, their spiritual nature, being half angelic, could not be annihilated. Their spirits were stripped from their fleshly bodies, but were not imprisoned in the abyss with their Watcher fathers. Instead, a divine judgment was pronounced upon them. They would be cursed to remain on the earth as disembodied, malignant spirits, forever hungry, forever thirsty, and forever hostile to humanity. This is the forbidden origin story of demons. Let that sink in. The demons that the New Testament describes, the unclean spirits that Jesus cast out, were not, according to this ancient testimony, a separate class of fallen angels. They were the lingering, ghostly souls of the dead Nephilim, the monstrous offspring of the Watchers. Their very nature is defined by their tragic, hybrid state. They remember having bodies, and they long to inhabit them again. This is why they seek to possess humans, to drive animals to destruction, to inflict sickness and madness. They are cosmic orphans, belonging neither to heaven nor fully to earth. And they vent their eternal frustration on the race from which their mothers came. Now you see the profound danger of this revelation to the gatekeepers. It provides a specific, historical, and almost biological explanation for the existence of demons. This was far too messy, too specific for the more streamlined theology that the later church wanted to build. A vague, undefined concept of demons as simply fallen angels was much easier to manage than this complex and terrifying story of ghostly, half-breed giants. By erasing the full story of the Nephilim, they didn't just remove a strange tale about giants. They erased the very definition and origin of the demonic forces that their own scriptures would later describe. They left us in a spiritual war without a proper enemy-combatant identification guide. They hid the truth that the demons Jesus confronted were not just abstract forces of evil, but the very real, very ancient ghosts of the monstrous beings who had once walked the earth. Just as Genesis is vague about the precise nature of the Watchers' crimes, it is utterly silent on their ultimate fate. The sons of God are mentioned, and then they vanish from the narrative, leaving the reader to assume they were either destroyed in the flood or simply faded away. This silence is another act of deliberate censorship, because the Book of Enoch provides a detailed and terrifying account of their final verdict and the nature of their imprisonment. Enoch testifies that the rebellion of the Watchers did not go unanswered in the heavenly court. God dispatched his most powerful archangels, Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel, to act as divine marshals. Their mission was not to negotiate, but to execute a sentence. Enoch describes a series of cosmic battles and judgments. The leader of the rebellion, Samjaza, and his followers were captured. Another, Azazel, who taught humanity the art of war, was bound hand and foot and cast into a desolate desert under sharp and jagged rocks. But their ultimate punishment was not immediate annihilation. This is the forbidden truth. They were sentenced to be imprisoned in a subterranean realm of total darkness. bound in chains, to await the final great day of judgment. They were not destroyed, they were incarcerated. Enoch describes their prison as being in the valleys of the earth, a deep, fiery abyss where they would be tormented until the end of the age. This revelation is so significant that echoes of it actually survived the censorship and made it into the New Testament itself. The Apostle Peter speaks of it directly, writing, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, Tartarus, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment." And the Apostle Jude writes, "And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day." Both Peter and Jude are clearly referencing the Enochian account. They knew this story. The early church knew this story. So why was the full narrative, the source of their references, erased? The reason for censorship is clear. This story establishes a precedent for a multi-stage judgment. It reveals that some of the most powerful evil beings in the universe are not currently active, but are imprisoned, awaiting a future final release and judgment. This introduces a level of complexity to eschatology, the study of end times, that the later church found uncomfortable. A simpler narrative, God, man, a one-time judgment, was easier to control and teach. The idea of a hidden, subterranean prison filled with powerful, chained angelic beings awaiting a future parole was too wild, too mythological. By removing the full story of the Watcher's imprisonment, the gatekeepers could simplify the timeline of judgment. But in doing so, they hid from us a terrifying and crucial piece of intel. The worst of God's enemies are not yet defeated. They are simply in chains, and the day of their final confrontation is still to come. With the full, terrifying story of the Watchers laid bare, their organized conspiracy, their twin crimes of hybridization and forbidden knowledge, the demonic genesis of their offspring, and their imprisonment in a subterranean abyss, the question becomes unavoidable. Why would the gatekeepers of the faith, the scribes and church fathers, go to such extraordinary lengths to erase this entire narrative from our sacred history? The culprits were not simple censors. They were the identity erasers. Their goal was to fundamentally reshape the story of evil, to transform it from a complex cosmic drama involving specific, named supernatural entities into a simpler, more abstract moral fable. Their motives were rooted in a desire to create a faith that was more rational, more manageable, and less vulnerable to the pagan mythologies that surrounded them. First, they needed to simplify the origin of evil. The story of the Watchers, with its detailed account of a planned rebellion by 200 named angels, was theologically messy. It raised difficult questions about God's sovereignty and the security of the heavenly realm. A much cleaner, more philosophically tidy explanation was to place the entire burden of sin's origin on the single free will choice of one man, Adam. By erasing the Watchers, they could create a neat, linear narrative, perfect creation, human fall, redemption. The messy prequel of a celestial civil war was cut for the sake of a simpler plot. Second, they needed to demystify the nature of demons. The Enochian account, which identifies demons as the disembodied spirits of the half-angelic Nephilim, was too specific, too biological, too strange. It was far easier to speak of demons in vague, abstract terms as fallen angels or unclean spirits, without giving them a concrete and horrifying origin story. This allowed evil to become a more manageable philosophical problem rather than a historical reality involving monstrous, ghostly entities. Finally, they sought to protect the image of a serene and orderly heaven. A story of a mass defection by a significant portion of God's angelic guardians was an embarrassment. It implied a level of dissent and conflict that did not align with the image of perfect, untroubled celestial harmony. By replacing the specific term, the Watchers, with the ambiguous phrase, Sons of God, they could blur the identities, dilute the numbers, and soften the impact of this shocking mutiny. The identity erasers were not necessarily acting out of malice. They were acting as theological public relations specialists. They were trying to rebrand the faith for a new era, to make it more palatable to a world that was moving away from myth and toward reason. But in their attempt to manage the story, they committed the ultimate act of censorship. They erased the enemy's name, his history, and his strategy from our most important briefing documents. The decision to erase the full story of the Watchers from the canonical record has had a profound and crippling legacy. It has left the Western faith fighting a spiritual war with a crucial chapter torn out of its strategic manual. By rendering the enemy nameless and his history obscure, the gatekeepers left us in a state of strategic disadvantage, facing a foe whose identity, methods, and origins we no longer fully understand. The first and most significant consequence is a loss of context for the entire biblical narrative. Without the story of the Watchers, the Great Flood becomes an almost incomprehensible act of divine wrath. It appears as though God drowned the entire world simply because humanity had become wicked. But when we restore the Enochian account, we understand the true nature of the crisis. The flood was not just a punishment. It was a desperate act of cosmic quarantine to stop a demonic, transhumanist project from succeeding. The story of Noah's Ark is not just a story of salvation from sin. It's a story of the preservation of the pure human genome. Secondly, we have lost the true origin story of demons. This has left a vacuum in Christian theology that has been filled with vague and often contradictory explanations. More importantly, it has robbed us of a key piece of strategic intelligence. The Enochian account reveals that demonic spirits are fundamentally parasitic, driven by a memory of physical existence and a desperate need to inhabit a host. This understanding sheds a powerful light on the nature of temptation, addiction, and the very mechanics of spiritual oppression. By erasing their origin, we have been left to fight these entities without fully understanding their nature or their motives. Finally, the legacy of this censorship is a faith that often underestimates the intelligence, the organization, and the ancient, deep-seated hatred of the enemy. The story of the oath on Mount Hermon reveals an enemy that is strategic, disciplined, and unified in its rebellion. By reducing the fall to a simple story of pride, Lucifer, or lust, the sons of God, we have been given a one-dimensional caricature of a multifaceted and highly organized foe. We have been left to fight an enemy without a name, without a history, and without a clear motive beyond a generic hatred of God. The identity erasers, in their attempt to simplify the story of evil, left us dangerously naive. They gave us a simplified faith, but in doing so, they left us vulnerable to a complex and ancient enemy whose full story they decided we were not meant to know. For 2 millennia, the full, unabridged file on the Watchers has been classified, locked away in the censored archives of history. We have been left to fight a war in a fog, aware of a generic enemy, but denied the specific intelligence that could lead to victory. But the seals on the archives have been broken. The testimonies of Enoch and Jubilees have been brought back into the light. The full, unredacted story of the angelic rebellion is no longer a forbidden secret. It is now a choice. The choice is no longer in the hands of the ancient identity erasers. The power to know the full story of the enemy has been returned to this generation. You have been presented with the evidence. You have heard the testimony of the conspiracy on Mount Hermon, the twin crimes of hybridization and forbidden knowledge, the demonic origin of their offspring, and their final, chained judgment. And so you stand at a critical intersection of knowledge. You can choose to remain with the simplified, sanitized version of the story. You can continue to see the sons of God as a vague, undefined mystery and the origin of evil as a simple fable. It is a less disturbing and perhaps more comfortable version of reality. Or you can choose to open the full intelligence report. You can choose to know your enemy. This is not about giving glory to darkness. It is about obeying the ancient strategic wisdom that says the first step to defeating an adversary is to understand him, to know his name, his history, his methods, and his motives. To choose to learn about the Watchers is to choose to be strategically equipped, to move from a state of naive faith to one of awakened, discerning vigilance. The gatekeepers decided that you were better off not knowing the full truth about the enemy. They chose to send you into battle with a heavily redacted manual. Now, you have the choice to read the uncensored version. Will you honor their fear, or will you arm yourself with forbidden knowledge? The recovery of the full story of the Watchers is not an academic exercise. It is an act of spiritual warfare. To learn their names, to understand their crimes, and to acknowledge their history is to reject the very censorship that was designed to keep us strategically blind. It is a declaration that we are no longer content to fight a nameless, faceless enemy. We choose to be informed. We choose to be prepared. This journey into the forbidden history of the fallen angels was never meant to inspire fear, but to instill courage, the courage that comes from clarity. The Bible is not a collection of comforting bedtime stories. It is the field manual for a cosmic war. And the story of the Watchers is the missing first chapter of that manual, the one that details the enemy's initial invasion and the devastating consequences of his first campaign. So let this revelation be a call to arms, a call to a more vigilant, more discerning, and more biblically complete faith. Dare to read the ancient texts that the gatekeepers tried to hide. Understand that the war we are in is not an abstract concept. It is a conflict with a specific history, a named enemy, and eternal stakes. Honor the memory of what happened in the days before the flood, not to dwell on the darkness, but to appreciate the profound light of the victory that was won at the cross. Jesus did not come merely to forgive human mistakes. He came to crush the works of the devil, to defeat the very same ancient powers that first corrupted his creation. The story of the Watchers does not diminish the gospel. It magnifies it, revealing the true cosmic scale of the battle that Christ won on our behalf. History does not just record the heroes, it must also record the traitors. Welcome to the unabridged, uncensored account of the angels who betrayed both heaven and earth.